Did you catch those news stories a couple months ago about how the president of Bolivia stepped down? Did you notice how they kind of faded into the background after a while? Well, today I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. Since Evo Morales fled to Mexico and Janina Nez took her place as the interim president of Bolivia in early November, events in the country have kind of faded out of the mainstream news cycle. But the contentious events in November and the upcoming elections in May should not be ignored. But what really led up to Morales' ouster? What caused Janina Nez to be the one to take his place? Why were the elections so contentious? Very few articles actually go into detail about the reasons behind all of this, much less describe the political context in which it happened. So that's the goal of my video today. 1. Evo Morales Ima was born in 1959 and was inaugurated as the first indigenous president of Bolivia in 2006. He's a part of the Movement for Socialism, or MAS, which is Bolivia's left-wing party. Morales is Aymara, an indigenous group across Bolivia, Chile, and Peru, which has seen repression from the wealthy, generally European elites throughout history. Morales' election to Congress in 1997 and then the presidency in 2006 was, for many, a turning point in Bolivian history. His candidacy for the presidency in 2006 centered around lifting up lower-income families, returning land to indigenous peoples, and reclaiming Bolivian industry from multinational corporations. He was elected as what's known as part of Latin America's Pink Tide when he and a number of other leftist candidates were elected to presidencies across Latin America, including Lula da Silva in Brazil and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The Pink Tide was a response to Latin American experiences in the latter half of the 20th century, when most, if not all, Latin American countries suffered under a US-backed dictator, growing wealth inequality, and industry repeatedly being sold off to US corporations. As a result, the anti-imperialist, anti-neoliberal, populist nature of Morales and his peers genuinely appealed to Latin American people. In his first term, Morales won with 53.7% of the vote, then 64.2% and 61.7% in his second and third terms respectively. During his presidency, Morales enacted policies that nearly entirely reshaped Bolivian society.
As an Aymara himself and the first indigenous president, Morales strengthened indigenous rights throughout Bolivia. His administration drafted a new constitution in 2009, which declared Bolivia a plurinational state and allowed autonomy, nationality, and land to the 36 original peoples groups in Bolivia. In total, he redistributed 35 million hectares of land to indigenous groups. His national land reform policy helped bring the nation out of extreme poverty. When he took office in 2006, the Bolivian poverty rate was 59.9%. By 2017, the poverty rate was almost halved at 34.6%. Just between 2006 and 2009, Morales' administration redistributed 23 million hectares from the wealthy elites to the working class. Additionally, he oversaw a 300% increase in the minimum wage, from 440 bolivars per month to 2,060. One of his largest successes is the Yes, I Can program, begun soon after he took office in 2006. This program provided educational services to rural and underserved communities across Bolivia in order to reduce the country's high illiteracy rate. Between 2001 and 2014, the illiteracy rate reduced from 13.28% to 3.8%, low enough by UNESCO standards that Bolivia is now categorized as a fully literate nation. He also vastly improved the infrastructure of his country. New hospitals, schools, and roads appeared in areas of the country that were previously remote and disconnected. 4,500 of Bolivia's 16,000 educational establishments and 3,000 new public health centers have been constructed during Morales' time in office.
Needless to say, these policies were all pretty expensive, but Morales was able to get away with taking out relatively few international loans, and in fact paid for most of them by nationalizing Bolivia's key industries. Bolivia's gas, mining, telecommunications, oil, water, and electricity industries were all taken under the wing of the public sector. This brought in immense profits from the government, which were then funneled directly into education, infrastructure, welfare, and healthcare programs. Before Morales' administration, multinational corporations could walk away with up to 85% of the profits from Bolivia's raw materials. Now they can only take about 10 to 20% of that. But Morales' policies of nationalization haven't exactly garnered the best of attention. He got criticism for them, not from his own people, but from the US government. In fact, in documents released by WikiLeaks, the US ambassador to Bolivia warned Morales that funding from the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund all depended on Morales' good behavior. That good behavior, of course, was not nationalizing profitable industries for US multinational corporations, especially oil, which Morales did anyway, kind of putting himself on the US's hit list, if you will. The first indigenous president hasn't been without fault, however. In 2011, he received harsh criticism from his own people for his plans to build a highway through a national park and indigenous territory. Morales didn't back down on this plan, even after environmental activists and indigenous people protested against it, until it escalated into police violence against protesters in La Paz. Additionally, he faced criticism for the fact that a former romantic partner of his was linked to a Chinese construction firm that had received millions of dollars in state contracts from the Bolivian government. Morales insisted that there was no corruption in his government, even inviting an investigation, saying that he had nothing to hide, but the claims of corruption against him followed him until his ousting in 2019. Probably the largest amount of criticism that he garnered during his presidency came in 2016, when he announced that he wanted to run for the 2019 presidency. The problem was that this was against Bolivia's still new constitution. He had run out of terms that he could run. But he decided to put it up to a referendum, offering for the Bolivian people to vote whether they wanted him to run for a fourth term in office or they wanted him to step down. With 51% of people voting against him running again, it looked like Morales wasn't going to be able to run in 2019. But by the end of the year, he made it increasingly clear that he was going to ignore the referendum and attempt to run anyway. It was in this context that we enter the 2019 elections. But no one could have expected that the far-right leader, Janina Nez, would be the one to take his place.
Janina Nez Chavez, born in 1967, is a lawyer and former TV host who now serves as the interim president of Bolivia. She is a part of Bolivia's far-right Democratic Unity Party, and little is known about her life before she entered politics a decade ago. However, she has faced intense criticism in the past for her now archived racist tweets, stating in one that she, quote, dreams of a Bolivia free of satanic indigenous rights, a clearly nationalist talking point in a country whose history is marred by anti-indigenous colonialism. With the context of the thoughts she expressed in her tweets, the backlash against her swearing in as interim president on an ornate Bible is additionally threatening. Indigenous people in Bolivia and across the world have been persecuted in the name of Christianity for centuries. A Christian supremacist president is cause for concern, especially in Latin America.
The OAS, or the Organization of American States, was founded in 1948, with the express purpose of combating communism in the Western Hemisphere. Currently, about 60% of its funding comes from the United States, so it can't really be considered an unbiased source in Latin American elections, especially when candidates further to the left are involved, like Evo Morales. With the slogan, "More rights for more people," the OAS's current stated goal is to enforce international law throughout the Western Hemisphere, and to reinforce the rules of representative democracy with due respect for the principles of non-intervention, according to their website.
However, the OAS has a history of getting involved in democratic elections in Latin America, corrupt or not. When the elected government of Haiti was overthrown in 2004 by U.S. interests, the OAS reversed their formerly positive stance on the legitimacy of the election. Their first reversal of an official election also occurred in Haiti in 2011, ostensibly setting a precedent for more direct involvement in the democratic processes of various states by the OAS. The Center for Economic and Policy Research found the justification for their reversal of the 2011 Haitian election to be unfounded and likely in the interests of Washington. In an archived version of the 2018 congressional budget justification of the State Department, funding of the OAS is justified because the organization, quote, promotes U.S. political and economic interests in the Western Hemisphere by countering the influence of anti-U.S. countries. As mentioned previously, Morales' government faced conflict with the U.S. government throughout his term, with leaked documents describing U.S. aid, which funds the OAS, funding opposition groups of Morales and encouraging anti-MAS violence. It could be inferred that Morales' Bolivia would have been considered anti-U.S. As such, the OAS is not an impartial moderator in Bolivia's elections. Now that I've provided some context, what actually happened in the October elections? First, I have to emphasize that the Bolivian elections are much different than elections in the United States. In Bolivia, when someone casts their vote, the ballot is collected and their vote is put into a tally sheet, which is then signed off on by 6 jurors who all individually counted the tally and agreed on its accuracy. Non-binding results are then sent to the Servicio de Registro Cívico, or SERECI, so that the media can report on preliminary results. The physical tally sheets are then sent to the Departamento Electoral Tribunal, or the TED, so the official count can be conducted. At the request of the OAS, this election included a quick count conducted by the Tribuno Supremo Electoral, or TSE, which would report the non-binding results of SERECI. As the non-binding results are meant to project a victor, the TSE agreed with the OAS to stop the quick count after approximately 80% of the tally sheets were reported. To achieve an unchallenged victory, a candidate needs more than 50% of the vote, or 40% with a 10-point lead on the second place candidate. Otherwise, for example, if a race was 42-34, a runoff election between just the 2 candidates is held. The OAS, in this election, also sent an electoral observation mission, consisting of 92 observers in 9 departments across Bolivia, with the stated goal of ensuring the veracity of the election. On October 20th, voters went to the polls with 9 candidates on the ballot, of whom 2 were truly competitive: Evo Morales of the Movement for Socialism and Carlos Mesa of the centrist Comunidad Ciudadana party. As people began casting their ballots, both the public quick count and the slower binding count were progressing. On the evening of October 20th, the TSE ended the quick count with 83.85% of the votes, 45.71% of which went to Morales and 37.84% for Mesa. Notably, this lead, with 83% of the votes reporting, would not have given Morales the election, as he didn't have the required 10-point lead to avoid a runoff election. However, as noted by the CEPR analysis of this election, the sources of the early votes came from largely urban areas, where Morales' support base was much weaker. Votes coming in from later rural areas would have been more skewed towards Morales. So, on October 25th, when the official counts results were announced, the results were 47.08% for Morales and 36.5% for Mesa, giving Morales a close 10.5% lead and the election. The credibility of these results was called into question a few days before, when the Electoral Observation Mission of the OAS issued a statement condemning the inexplicable nature of the quick count ending after only 85% of the vote was counted, despite the TSE and the OAS previously agreeing on this stopping point. At the request of the OAS, the quick count was resumed 23 hours after it stopped, on October 21st. As the quick count progressed further, Morales began to take the lead, as with the official count. Despite the apparent consistency of the results of both the quick count and the binding results, as recently confirmed by MIT statisticians, the OAS insisted the election was fraudulent. As public anger over the OAS's declaration of election tampering grew, Morales conceded and agreed to a re-election with more oversight and no stoppage of the quick count. It should be restated here that the legally binding vote count never stopped for any period of time, and so would have been very difficult to tamper with. Despite Morales' agreement to a repeat election, the military called for him to step down. He did so on November 10th.
At the time that Morales was asked by the military to resign, violence and intimidation against MAS supporters had increased. Several MAS senators had even resigned as the protesters reached their doorstep. Reportedly, multiple MAS ministers' houses were burned down by these right-wing protesters. In the case of a power vacuum where there's no president or vice president, the Bolivian constitution states that the power will first transfer to the president of the Senate, then the president of the Chamber of Deputies, then the vice president of the Senate, and so on. This is different from the American system in that the power doesn't transfer entirely. It goes to the interim president, whose sole purpose is to institute a legitimate election in the next 90 days, which will then put in place a legitimate president. This is also different from the American system in that the interim president must be sworn in by the legislative branch. Janina Nez was vice president of the Senate when she was sworn in front of an empty chamber on November 12th. 2 days after Evo Morales and his vice president took asylum in Mexico. The president of the Senate and the president of the Chamber of Deputies were both MAS members who had resigned out of fear of violence.
Much of the rest of the legislative branch was boycotting her swearing in protest of her racist past and promotion of anti-MAS violence. Tampering or no, Janina Nez's party only received 4% of the vote in the October 20th elections. Nez was sworn in on a large, ornate Bible, saying that, quote, "The Bible has returned to the government palace." In the context of her Christian supremacy, these comments are incredibly concerning and a foreshadowing of how she would continue her interim presidency. Nez was swift in consolidating power, first appointing primarily white, wealthy business elites to her cabinet, whose interests were in reprivatizing the nationalized resources that Morales famously used to fund education and healthcare programs. When her soldiers began firing on protesters, the soldiers responsible for the deaths of those protesters were given impunity. In just the weekend after Nez was sworn in, 8 protesters were killed. Additionally, her own ministers began threatening opposition journalists, protesters, and even other lawmakers with arrests for sedition. This escalated in late January when Nez issued an arrest warrant to an MAS member who had announced his bid for the presidency. Nez's deadline to call a new election was February 12th, 90 days after she was sworn in. After intense pressure, she set the date as May 3rd. Although intimidation against MAS members has caused concerns over the credibility of the elections, especially with journalists such as Oli Vargas, who do a lot of on-the-ground work in Bolivia. He's noted that the intimidation and violence against MAS members would lead to an illegitimate election, in addition to the fact that not only the OAS, but also USAID, another organization famous for meaning to advance only U.S. interests, are going to be monitoring the elections. Luis Arce Catacora was announced recently as the MAS's primary candidate for the presidency after Evo Morales was barred from running. Less than a day after Catacora announced his bid for the presidency, he was issued with an arrest warrant for corruption and sedition. These elections are not going to be legitimate. And Janina Nez and her U.S. backers are not going to step down easily, but neither will the Bolivian people.